The New Orleans Saints have long been a proponent for the ideology that even though you could do something, doesn't mean that you should do something. And that's exactly the way that I approach any talk about an Alvin Kamara trade. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, you can subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss a daily episode or upload. And as always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media. You can find me as the senior reporter and writer over at Saints News Network, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site covering the New Orleans Saints, Tuesdays on Locked On NFL Podcast, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're going to be diving into the individual high-ranking New Orleans Saints draft class by one of the best draft analysts out there. We'll take a look at that, not a grade around the draft class as a whole, but individual marks for each of these players before they were drafted. That's an important key. We'll break that down. We'll also take a look at whether or not this was a successful offseason so far, at least for New Orleans. But first, even though the Saints technically could trade away Alvin Kamara, they absolutely shouldn't. So why are we discussing this? Well, this is actually a question that I get a lot. So I figured there's enough people that have asked me about it that I feel like if I made an episode and I spoke about it here, that you'd care. And so here I am answering the question finally that people have been asking me all offseason. Should the New Orleans Saints consider trading Alvin Kamara? My bottom line answer is no, but I want to make sure that I look at this from both sides of the coin. So I explored where it could work, but why it still doesn't make sense. Here's first where it could work. After June 1st. And that's not that far away. We're already here in May 7th as I record this, May 8th, potentially as you're watching or listening to this. If the Saints waited until after June 1 to trade Alvin Kamara, they could defer some of the dead money, the dead cap, which would be over $23 million worth of that would end up coming back to New Orleans in that case. And because they're deferring it, it gives them an opportunity to offset some of the costs because Alvin Kamara has base salaries of $25 million and more and later on down the line that end up offsetting the dead money that would set in because the Saints already have that dead money on their books anyway, or have that money on their books anyway, because all of the dead money that effectively remains outside of $1.08 million as base salary this year is all signing bonus, prorated bonuses, things like that. So still stuff that the Saints have cooked up themselves, but if they wait until after June 1st, they could kick some of that down the road, not have to foot the bill immediately. The tricky part in all of this is that, you can't designate a player as a post-June 1 trade the way that you can as a post-June 1 cut or a post-June 1 transaction. You have to literally wait until post-June 1 to do that. Why would the New Orleans Saints do that? Well, obviously he has the legal trouble that's kind of plagued him over the course of the past couple of past couple of off seasons, or not really plagued him. It's just kind of looming over his name. Every time that I mention Alvin Kamara's name, there's always something about, him and his ongoing legal process or the altercation that took place, or the alleged altercation, I guess technically we have to say at this time, but alleged altercation that took place outside of the Pro Bowl in Vegas and all these other things. And so that's a reason I think that you look at maybe the Saints looking to offload him, but there's been nothing really in their past that says that when a guy has off-field activities and off-field this, that, and the other concerns, if you will, that the Saints will steer clear of that. They've pursued those guys. So I don't know if really saying that because Alvin Kamara has gotten into this situation or is now in this situation, that all of a sudden he's a tradable asset because the Saints, quote unquote, won't stand for it. I don't think that's true. I just don't think that the track record shows that. Not to be unfair to New Orleans and not even to criticize any of it. I just don't think that the idea of leaping to the conclusion that the Saints won't stand for that type of behavior, based on what evidence? Based on what evidence makes that suggestion? Now, the Saints have gone high character, high makeup, all of those other things in the draft. They've done all of that over the course of this offseason. They've cared very much about their locker room. Alvin Kamara is not a disruption to their locker room. yes, this legal ongoing process is a bit of a distraction because it looms over the team, it looms over the player, but he's not a locker room problem and he's not a concern in that area at all. So I don't think that there's really enough here to say that the Saints, quote, won't stand for Alvin Kamara and therefore would want to ship him out. Now, if there's more to the story, if the Saints have dealt with other things, if the Saints did see him as a locker room problem, then all of a sudden everything changes, right? Then the whole tone of it all completely shifts. But I don't have that information. No one seems to be reporting that. No one seems to believe that. So why would we just sit here and speculate that he is a problem when all signs point to him not being that kind of a problem? So that's my one thing is like, there's really not enough evidence to say that the Saints should trade him or that the Saints would want to trade him. The other piece of it is, are you confident enough in the rest of your running back room to be able to do that? You've got Jamaal Williams, $4 million per year. That's pretty good. You've got a running back that's not even 21 years old yet, turns 21 years old next month, and Kendre Miller, who's electrifying, who's exciting, who's a breakaway guy, who's a big play, he's a home run hitter, all those other things. He's going to be in a rookie deal for you. You've got Benjamin, who can catch out of the backfield, but you still need to kind of figure out who he is. You've got Sir Roderick Thompson that you brought in as an undrafted free agent. We'll see if he makes the roster. But do you really feel that you have enough to overcome the loss of what an Alvin Kamara brings you, especially in an offense, especially in an offense that's about to have Derek Carr at the helm, who will throw out of the backfield, whose best friend in the Las Vegas Raiders offense over the course of the past couple of years has been not only the big tight end, Darren Waller, but also the running back out of the backfield in Josh Jacobs. The other piece to this is, what are you realistically going to get back for a player that could potentially be suspended for about half of the season in 2023 or soon thereafter? What are you really going to get for him? You can look back to the Calvin Ridley trade. Jacksonville Jaguars traded for Calvin Ridley while he was suspended, knowing that they were making a move for him for the year after. They traded away a 2023 fifth rounder that could turn into a sixth rounder. They traded away a 2024 second round pick that could turn into a third round pick. Or a third round pick that could turn into a second round pick, one of the two. And so I don't think you're going to get that for Alvin Kamara because Calvin Ridley, younger, first of all. Also, secondly, wide receiver, prime premier position. Running back, not considered a premier position in the NFL. And teams don't like to pay dividends for that position, whether that's monetary, whether that's draft capital, up until this past year, apparently, where two running backs were drafted in the first round, nor in terms of trade value. So maybe instead of getting that future, this year's fifth and a future second, you're probably getting more like this year's fifth and maybe a future fourth, maybe a future third. Maybe there's some conditions there to help that convey up to a second round pick, but it's very unlikely to start as a second round pick. I think there's a lot of people that are kind of spoiled by some of the things that you learn about how draft trades and how trades happen and stuff like that with some of these other things that we have access to that aren't actually the NFL, that we think, oh, well, Alvin Kamara is a big name, therefore you can get a first round selection for him. No, you can't. You simply can't. He's a running back. He's 29 years old, and he's got this legal matter and a potential suspension on the way. A team's not even trading for this year. If they traded for him, they're effectively trading for what he can do in 2024, potentially, for them at 30 years old. It doesn't make sense. If you're the New Orleans Saints, keep him in the building because he's the guy that can operate in your offense, whether he's 29 or 30 years old, and whether he's playing for 6 games or he's missing 6 games. Whatever it is, the Saints are in a situation to where they know what they have in Alvin Kamara. They know what their offense needs to be able to run, and they don't know if anyone else on their roster can provide what Alvin Kamara can provide because none of them have ever stepped foot on a football field dressed in a Saints uniform. It just hasn't happened yet, except for Benjamin. So I stick to what I said before. Just because the New Orleans Saints could do it, because the post-June 1 trade could make it a lot easier because of all of the non-guaranteed salary he has in his future, all those other things. Just because they could do it doesn't mean that they should do it. And in fact, my vote would be no. Now, if the Saints end up doing it, we'll break it down. We can talk about it. We can come back to this moment. I just don't see it happening. So that's where I stand on it. But I also didn't see them trading away C.J. Gardner-Johnson last year. Look what happened there. All right, coming up next, we're going to take a look at the Saints offseason as a whole. Has it been successful? Has it not been successful? Where do we rank it? Not by a grade, but effectively on a scale of most successful to most disappointing. We'll break that down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar on the market. Go ahead and compare it to any protein bar that you want. Do the taste test. Take a bite of this, take a bite of that. You can even find some of the same flavors, except you probably can't because Built has some incredible flavors, including like peanut butter puff. They've got peanut butter brownie, mint brownie, cookies and cream. They've got salted caramel, cherry barcia. There's so much cool stuff that they have over at Built Bar when it comes to their fantastic flavors. You can find all of them online at built.com, but make sure you head over quickly because supplies do tend to go quickly because of all their incredible flavors. And don't worry too, if you got a Walmart or a Sam's Club nearby, you can go ahead and get them today, right now. You can take me with you. Jump in the car right now. Head over to Walmart in the pharmacy section. You're going to find a 4-bar box of some of their best flavors, or you can head over to the Sam's Club and get a 13-bar box at Baker's Dozen of hit flavors like Churro Puff, as well as Brownie Batter Puff as well. Trust me, it doesn't get any better than these. Covered in 100% dark chocolate, 17, 18 grams of protein, but only 130 to 130 calories, 4 or 5 grams of sugar. It's awesome. Go and check them out today. Built.com, Walmart, Sam's Club. You can find the best tasting protein bar on the market. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Make sure you come back tomorrow. We're going to take a look back at the 2022 NFL draft class, Chris Olave, Trevor Penning, Alontae Taylor, and kind of look at where the draft class was graded or how the draft class was graded by a bunch of different outlets and things like that. But then take a look at maybe where we think it stands after actually seeing a full year of that draft class. We're going to do that for 2022, 2021, and 2020 as well. In fact, we should probably start with 2020 because of how not great that draft has turned out to be, but that's okay. We can get to that later on in the week. Let's start off today, though, with how the New Orleans Saints have done so far this offseason. Has it been a successful offseason for the New Orleans Saints? If we were to do maybe like a 5-step sort of ranking system from, excruciatingly disappointing to disappointing, neutral, successful, massively successful, where would you rank the Saints offseason? I think I kind of put it in the successful range. Not massively successful, but I'm above neutral. I'm above wait and see. I think it's been a successful offseason. And I think that's a lot of what the New Orleans Saints have been doing so far. They've been doing things that maybe folks would consider solid additions, right? Risk-averse approaches, not hampering themselves in their future. In fact, investing in their future with the way that they balance comp picks. They're in line for 2 4th-round compensatory picks next year and a 6th-round pick next year. Those are things that the Saints used to not necessarily overlook, but they didn't really invest much in. They would go out there and they would sign these guys and they would cancel out all their compensatory picks and things like that. But now they're in line for 3 of them things going into the next season. And you saw the way that they utilized that because they also used one of those 4th-round picks in order to be able to move up in the draft this year. So even when they use future draft capital, they use future draft capital that they knew they were already in line to recoup, as opposed to trading away a 1st-round pick, a 2nd-round pick, right? They didn't do any of that, future 1st or 2nd-round picks. So you look at that, you look at, going out and going after Derek Carr. Derek Carr is, if you think about the quarterbacks that changed teams this offseason, he's a B quarterback because A would be set by Aaron Rodgers, right? Aaron Rodgers changed from the Green Bay Packers to the New York Jets. And I'm actually glad the Saints weren't even involved in that, had nothing to do with that, didn't wait around for that, didn't even mess around with that. I'm glad that they did the same thing with Lamar Jackson, never got involved in that. Because what did I keep telling you over the course of the entire offseason? Lamar Jackson is not leaving Baltimore. There's no chance, no shot that he was ever leaving Baltimore. Now he's the highest paid quarterback. The Saints instead, they went out, they identified the guy that they wanted, and they went and got him, Derek Carr. And I think Derek Carr is in that B tier, that 2nd tier of quarterbacks that changed teams this offseason. He could potentially be an A tier quarterback, depending upon how we see Aaron Rodgers perform in 2023. He wasn't that great in 2022, if we're being honest, in terms of Aaron Rodgers. Now, he also wasn't happy. He was very unsettled. There was all this other stuff that was going on and everything like that. Like, those things have impact for sure. So you look at that, you look at him changing teams. I think right now you can consider Derek Carr kind of second in line there. Then you see them go out and they rebuild their depth on the defensive backs, right? They lose guys like David Onyemata, Shai Tuttle, Kentavious Street, but then they replace them with guys like Colin Saunders and Nathan Shepard and Brian Brzee. It's pretty solid, pretty good. Even the draft class this year, solid. Not a lot of risk. Your biggest risk is the guy that's 2 years removed from ACL and shoulder injuries and that had a kidney infection last year, but you're not going to hold that against him. And of course, all the other life stuff that he was dealing with, but none of those latter things aren't risks. What's your next biggest risk? Kendre Miller sprained MCL. I sprained my MCL taking the trash out today. Not a big deal. So when I look at and also he's 20 years old. I'm very much not, right? So you look at all of the kind of things the Saints have done over the course of the offseason, even going out and, look, they went and got Bryan Edwards, a guy that has chemistry with Derek Carr. Will Bryan Edwards make the roster? I don't know. We'll see, right? We got to see how all that goes throughout training camp and everything. You've got the star returner now in the building and Jalen Flowers coming out of Montana and all that. You've got another guy that could potentially steal a roster spot in Shaq Davis and you're out of South Carolina State. coming in your undrafted free agent class. Like there's space here to where they're going to have to move some stuff around in order for all these players to make the roster and whoever makes the roster. But to look at it and say that the Saints didn't do enough, or to look at it and say that the Saints took too big of risks, I don't think you could say either one of those things. I think they did what they needed to do. They addressed their quarterback spot. They've addressed running back. They've addressed defensive interior. They've addressed their offensive line, Nick Saldiveri. They went out there and addressed wide receiver. They brought Michael Thomas back. They've got guys like Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed continue to do work over the course of the offseason, getting ready for the year. They also added to that group with A.T. Perry. They go to their back end, to their defense. They've loaded up as with safeties. They've got great corners in Paulson Adebo and Marshawn Lattimore and Alante Taylor and Bradley Roby. They've got good players there. They've got two great safeties and Marcus May as well as Tyrann Mathieu, who rank near the top in some of those safety metrics out there that show you what the actual play is as opposed to just what broadcast safety play is. Things that make highlight reels. I think the Saints have done a good job. The one thing that they haven't really addressed and that they actually made, I'll use the phrase worse. I'd rather say more like weaker, was their tight end room. Their tight end room got weaker. Their linebacker room got weaker. But Anthony Orji, a guy they brought in as an undrafted free agent out of Vanderbilt, was a guy that some of the top draft analysts out there looked at as a 5th round selection in this year's draft, 6th round selection in this year's draft. And the Saints went and got him as an undrafted free agent. Everyone's excited about guys like A.T. Perry, who they drafted in the 6th round, a guy who was projected to be a higher selection, 4th, 5th. You look at a guy like Anthony Orji, who they got an undrafted free agency. He's a guy that was expected to be 5th, 6th. You can be excited about him too. It's okay. It's fine. Especially because you're not looking for a starter at linebacker. You've got Demario Davis. You've got Pete Werner. What are we talking about here? We're talking about depth. We're talking about somebody that can help rush the passer. That's probably Anthony Orji's. That's probably the best part of his game is his ability as a pass rusher, his ability as a stack linebacker. 40 plus stops, according to Pro Football Focus, in each of the last 2 years. Shout out Dylan Sanders at Dilly Sanders on Twitter for putting me on that. Like there's so many different pieces in terms of what the Saints have done this offseason that have been low risk, that won't cost them, if these players don't pan out, massive amounts of, this, that, or the other. The 1st round pick that they used to draft Brian Brzee, they got back for a coach that was never going to coach for them again. And they managed to get a 1st round pick back for that guy and Sean Payton. The Saints, I thought, did very well, have done very well so far this offseason. They still have 83. They have 83 of 90 roster spots filled so far. They still have what? What is that? 7? Yes, Ross, math. Ross Jackson does math. Shout out to the draft dudes. They still have 7 players that they can add. So when you look at, they still need to add to the tight end room and the linebacker room. Sure, there you go. There's space to do it. $16+ million in salary cap space that's hardly going to be impacted by the draft class, because as the draft class signs, they're knocking other guys out of the top 51, because only the top 51 players over the course of the offseason actually count against your salary cap. So every time that they sign somebody, $940,000 comes off the book, $1.08 million comes off the book, $1.08 million comes off the books. It all balances out. So they've got salary cap space, they've got roster space. And they have a roster that if they started the 2023 season with right now, they could get 53 players out of and be perfectly happy. And so once they add to those other positions, address linebacker, I think they could still add to their defensive interior. A guy like Michael Brocker's still out there. Shelby Harris still out there, who has a history with this Saints team. Linebacker, Deion Jones, Miles Jack. Like there's a bunch of players out there that they can still go to. You can still find veteran edge rushers out there if you still want them in Yannick Ngakoue. He's still out on the market. So I think the Saints have done a very good job being solid this offseason and of sound mind, not going out of their mind with big risks and trying to trade away 3 first-round picks to get this player or whatever. They didn't do any of that. They made sound investments throughout the offseason, and to me, that's a successful offseason. That's a successful offseason. I'm not going to get into the, they're really good on paper conversation, because we saw how far that took them last year. We have to see what they look like on the field. But in terms of the investments that they've made this offseason, sound. And that was backed up by their draft class, which according to somebody who we know, I love, and Dane Brugler out of The Athletic, one of my favorite draft analysts out there, somebody that I trust very much, had high rankings for almost every single one of those New Orleans Saints draft picks, 6 out of 7 ranking highly. And the 7th could have as well if we paid more attention to special teams. Let's break that down as we wrap up tonight's show over on Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints, looking at the individual high-ranking marks the New Orleans Saints draft class received before the draft even happened. You know me. I'm not a big fan of draft grades. I give them, I play the game, I do all the things because I'm for the people. Because I'm for the people. And people like grades. I get it. But one of the things that I really enjoy looking at is going to trusted draft analysts and kind of looking back at where they had the individual players ranked when it comes to the players that are selected in a draft class. Because sometimes what you'll see is that like somehow a team will take 7 players and 5 of them will be top 100 on their big board, but then they'll turn around and grade the draft a C as a whole, which never makes sense to me. And so I really like instead to just kind of look at where the players individually ranked before they were drafted by the team, where team opinion doesn't factor in. Analysts don't go out of their way to find things that the team could have done instead of grading what they did do and things like that. That's one of the reasons why I don't like the grade thing, but we'll break that down further on and kind of dismantle that line of thinking a little bit further in the week as we get to regrading some draft classes for the Saints. But I want to take a look at this because Brian Brzee was considered Dane Brugler over at The Athletic. Like I mentioned, he's a guy that I trust a lot when it comes to draft evaluation. Dane Brugler's top 300 players. Brian Brzee was listed as the 23rd ranked player. Okay. Next up, the Saints in the second round went and drafted Isaiah Foskey, the defensive end and edge rusher out of Notre Dame. He comes in as the 60th ranked player. Then in the third round, they went and got Kendre Miller, the running back out of TCU, ranked as the 104th best player. Nick Saldiveri was next in the fourth round, 96. And then in that same round, the Saints also drafted Jake Haener, who was ranked 102. Seeing the trend yet? Saints then went and got Jordan Howden, who was ranked at 251. We'll break that down here in a little bit. And then A.T. Perry is the way that they finished off the draft, who was ranked 98. So 23, 60, 104, in the 90s, 102, 251, 98. Of the 7 players that the Saints selected in this year's draft class, 6 of them ranked within the top 105 players on Dane Brugler's top 300. And if we really think about where Jordan Howden is going to have the largest impact as a depth safety that has the versatility to play free safety away from the line of scrimmage, that can play down in the box, that can play in the slot. It's played over 200 snaps in the slot. 4 out of his 5 seasons at Minnesota. And the 1 year where he didn't play 200 snaps in the slot in Minnesota, he played 184. And he also went over 300 slot snaps over the course of 2 of those 5 seasons. But where he's most going to contribute most immediately is going to be as a core special teamer if he makes the roster. 500 plus special team snaps out of the 3,000 defensive snaps, or in addition to the 3,000 defensive snaps that he played over the course of his career. He's a highly, highly experienced player. So if you think about where it is that he's going to have the greatest impact, which is likely on special teams, and then you were to rank all of the top special teamers in this year's draft in terms of punt, kick, coverage, all of those things, Jordan Howden's probably, let's be conservative and say a top 20 guy when it comes to that. Think about other guys like Hallisey, think about guys like Ben Van Sumeren, you think about guys like J.L. Skinner, and then of course you add in, Jordan Howden himself out of Minnesota. So when you look at where these Saints players ranked before the draft, before there was a fleur-de-lis on it, before there was any discussion of what draft trades did or didn't happen, before there was any discussion of what players were and weren't on the board, the Saints drafted effectively 6 top 105 players, which I think you can go so far as to say 6 top 100 players out of their 7 selections. And the one guy that they drafted that falls outside of that is an outlier based on where it is that he actually contributes most immediately, which is as a special teamer. That's a really solid draft class. So this backs up what we were just discussing. No big risks, solid, sound approaches to this New Orleans Saints draft class. And now you've got 6 players plus a 7th that are coming in that can have major impact on your team, whether it be this year or 3 years down the line. That's a great spot for New Orleans to be in. So when you see C+ grades, C- grades, you see some analysts that are out there saying, well, the Saints gave up a top 10 selection, so therefore I have to ding them for that. No, you don't. You genuinely don't. Grade the draft class for the players that were drafted, not because of some other stuff that makes the grade lower because that gets you clicks. You know what I mean? There's no need for any of that. look at where these players were in their draft in the draft process, and don't let the team that they ended up with or the way that the team gathered those players or whatever influence how you look at them as a collective draft class with an NFL team, because you're really just grading based on your feelings of that NFL team, aren't you? So when you look at sort of where the Saints players were before they were ever New Orleans Saints, they were majority top 100 selection. So how does that make you feel about this New Orleans Saints draft class? Doesn't it make a little bit more sense? And when you think about the guys that fell just outside of the top 100, 102, Jake Haener, 104, Kendre Miller, it's a good spot to be in. So it's just further evidence that the Saints offseason so far has been a sound one, a solid one, a successful one. And they still have some work left to do. Again, 7 roster spots still open. $16 million available to them. Let's call it conservatively $12 million once the undrafted free agent class is added in, guaranteed money from that. And then, of course, the actual draft class is added in. They have everything that they need to continue to build this team and fill the holes that they have left to address. And the holes that they have left to address are not primary positions. They're tight end. They're depth behind your starting linebackers. Their depth behind your starting defensive linemen, and maybe more depth at running back. Maybe more depth on your offensive line. More competition, probably. Actually, that's probably more likely the thing. It's not needs. It's competition that you want at certain positions. And then it's need at tight end because you made that room a little bit weaker by trading away Adam Troutman. Even if you just look at the numbers, I don't care how you feel about Adam Troutman, right? Like, the room got weaker because that's one less player that's there, and we don't know what Taysom Hill's role really is. So you got 3 tight ends effectively sitting on the roster. And one of them is Miller Forrestall, who no one knows anything about yet. So I think the Saints are in a good position here to walk into the 2023 season with a B offseason, but be an A team in their division. And I think that's the goal, to compete and win the division. And so far, the New Orleans Saints have made the moves that were necessary to believe that this team can come in and compete for what is a weak division and has a massive X factor, which is how do the Carolina Panthers look, and how quickly does Bryce Young get on the field, and how quickly do the Saints play that team before he gets on the field, because otherwise they're facing Andy Dalton, somebody they're very familiar with, and how quickly does Bryce Young translate to the NFL game, if at all. Solid spot. Oh, and of course, look, the Falcons did some interesting things, right? So what does that team end up looking like as well? So I think the Saints have done a great job, or good job, a solid B. Solid B. I wasn't a straight A student, y'all. I wasn't. I made it, though. I'm doing okay off my B's. And I think the Saints can be too. All right, coming up tomorrow, let's take a look back at the 2022 New Orleans Saints draft class. Chris Olave, Trevor Penning, Alontae Taylor, DeMarco Jackson, so on and so forth. And we'll take a look at what that draft class was graded after the fact, immediately after the fact, and how we're feeling about it 1 year later. We'll have that and much more coming up for you here all throughout the week here on Locked On Saints. Appreciate you as always for making me a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi. And give me 1 second. I want to make sure that I get the Twitter handle right, and I don't want to mess it up because it is a good friend's birthday, and I want to give Who Dat 17 at AK41FTW. That's Alvin Kamara, 41. That's his number for the win. So you already know he's saying what I'm saying. Don't do it. Don't do it, New Orleans. Want to wish him a happy birthday. Appreciate y'all very, very much, as always, for coming through for the show. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter, Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how your mom and them. Trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.